Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Transforming Your Network Through Virtualization, sponsored by netElastic. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we'll ask for your feedback. A survey will pop open on your screen and will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available after 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to Light Reading's Cable Video Practice Leader, Alan Bresnick. Alan?
Thank you, Beth. Good day, everyone. Welcome to our latest Broadband World News webinar entitled Transforming Your Network Through Virtualization. As Beth mentioned, my name is Alan Bresnick. I'm the Cable Video Practice Leader for Light Reading and a contributing analyst in Heavy Reading, which is the research arm of Light Reading. I will be your moderator today. Based outside Toronto, I specialize in the cable, video, and broadband technology markets. I put together this webinar in tandem with our exclusive sponsor, netElastic Systems. We have a compelling program for you today, focusing on network virtualization. In this session, we will look at the forces driving service providers to virtualize their networks and network functions, the challenges they face in doing so, and some key ways to overcome those hurdles. We'll explain how to get started with the virtualization process, and we'll home in on some case studies of 2 service providers carrying out network virtualization around the world. Okay, well, before we get started, just a reminder that the slides will advance automatically throughout the session. You may also download a copy of the slides, as Beth mentioned, by clicking on the Additional Resources button located below the presentation window. As usual, we will have an audience question and answer session at the end of this webinar. You can take part in the Q&A session at any point by asking questions. Just type your question into the Ask a Question area and then click the Submit button. During the webinar, we will also conduct 2 audience polls to learn about your network virtualization plans and views. So we'll be covering a lot of ground here. Okay, so at this point, let's take a quick look at our main speaker today. He is David Williams. David is Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing for netElastic Systems. Dave will join us a little bit later from the Bay Area. I introduce him in a bit. Okay, let's look at today's agenda. Not surprisingly, we have plenty to cover over the next hour. After my introduction here, I'll quickly run through some industry drivers for virtualization. We'll talk about FTTH deployments around the world. Then Dave will take over and run through the rest of everything that's here, from service provider challenges on through all the different phases of virtualization. And then at the end, we will take your questions, and hopefully there'll be a lot of those. Okay, so just to set the context here, this slide shows you, this graph shows you how home internet data usage has been rising or really surging amid the COVID-19 crisis, especially in the last couple of weeks, as more and more people are working from home and people doing school from home and all sorts of other things from home. This graph comes to us courtesy of Open Vault, which we published last week on the Light Reading website, and it'd be interesting to see how the curves continue to go up or flatten out over the next few weeks. We'll take a look at that. Keep posted to the Light Reading website. I'm sure we'll have more stories about that. This graph, this chart, comes to us courtesy of Verizon, also from a story that we ran last week, showing which applications are sort of leading the way in terms of home internet usage during this virus crisis. As you can see, gaming is way up. Gaming use is way up. VPN use is way up with all the people working from home. Web traffic is up. Video is up. Surprisingly, video is not up as much as I would have thought. I would have thought that that'd be much more than 12%, but we'll see how that goes over the next few weeks and whether that also trends up even higher. Speaking of video usage and gaming usage, this slide talks about how both have been surging and will continue to surge. I won't go through everything here, but some of the key points are, as we've reported, Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, and YouTube are all been cutting streaming bit rates across Europe for the next 30 days to help ease the strain on broadband networks. I would suspect that this is also going to take place in North America at some point. It hasn't been announced yet, but I would think all over the world we're going to see these big streaming players cutting their bit rates, getting away from Ultra HD in order to ease the strain on broadband networks. And one example of what's happening, Telecom Italia reported that a more than 70% increase in internet traffic over its landline network, with a big contribution coming from online games like Fortnite. Internet video traffic, as you saw on the last slide, has been rising and is expected to continue to rise. Some older information, which will need to be updated, coming from Cisco's annual Visual Networking Index, shows that internet video traffic is forecast to grow 400% over the 5-year period starting in 2017 through 2022. It'll be interesting to see how those numbers get changed now. But what Cisco is already forecasting is that video will account for 82% of all internet traffic by 2022, up from 75% 3 years ago and 63% in 2015. Also, Cisco is forecasting that 4K Ultra HD video will account for almost a quarter of global IP video traffic by 2022, compared with a mere 3% in 2017. Some other drivers. As you can see here, we're going to be talking a lot about fiber. Fiber is definitely the biggest enabler of gigabit deployments around the world. In the U.S., fiber is accounting for nearly 60% of U.S. gigabit deployment. Cable, HFC, is accounting for most of the rest, almost 40%. But take a look around the rest of the world, taking into account Europe, especially Europe and Asia, as we'll get into on the next couple of slides. Fiber is accounting for nearly 90% of gigabit deployments around the world, while HFC is accounting for less than 10%. So fiber is clearly the key to gigabit deployments in most parts of the world, and even in North America, even in the U.S. Now, this graph, which is probably impossible to read, but it should give you an idea of what the penetration rates are for fiber in Europe. Some nations are ahead of other nations, but in general, Europe now has more than 60 million homes that are passed by fiber to the home or fiber to the basement. This is courtesy of the latest stats from the FTTH Council Europe. This compares to about 46 million U.S. households that are now passed by FTTH lines, with that number also climbing at a healthy clip each year, according to the latest stats we have from the Fiber Broadband Association in the U.S. Now let's look at the picture globally. Once again, a graph that's almost impossible to read, but it gives you the sense of where penetration rates stand among all the different nations across Europe and Asia. As you can see here, the Asia-Pacific region is way ahead of every other region in terms of fiber to the home and fiber to the basement lines, boasting a whopping 550 million homes passed by fiber networks. And these stats come to us from the FTTH Council Asia-Pacific. Once again, you'll be able to take a look at these closer when you download a copy of the slides later on. Okay, so why does virtualization make sense for service providers? Dave is going to get into this a lot more, but I just want to give you a little bit of taste of that. Whoops, I jumped a slide there. Sorry about that. Go back to where we were. 3 basic reasons. First of all, operations. By virtualizing, service providers can automate things so they can simplify and orchestrate their operations. Second big benefit of virtualization, scale. Allows them to scale their infrastructure a lot easier, a lot quicker, a lot cheaper. They can virtualize, centralize, and then distribute functions once they virtualize. Third big factor, services. Virtualization allows operators to create services a lot quicker, a lot easier, and so it gives them a lot greater ability for innovation, and it allows them to be much more agile than they were before in developing, deploying, and trying out new services. Okay, so that was just a tip of the iceberg there. With that, I'm going to turn things over to our main presenter, Dave Williams of netElastic Systems. So good morning to you, Dave. Thanks for joining us bright and early today.
Morning. Yeah, good morning, Alan. Thanks for that good view of the industry.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm going to continue this webinar with kind of looking at some additional service provider challenges that we're seeing as we work with and talk to service providers around the globe, and why they're looking at virtualization to keep up with some of these changes that Alan helped illustrate for us, and what that virtualization really looks like for some of the carriers that we're working with. And then I'll also look at how some different carriers within the market have been dealing with that transition from the traditional platforms to virtualization. There's a number of strategies that different carriers are pursuing, and I'll share some perspectives that we've seen out there. And then kind of close out with some actual customer case studies and look at how they've approached and are benefiting from the virtualization that they've implemented. So let's start with just some of the service provider challenges. This really builds on what Alan just talked about, and the tremendous changes in broadband, the deployment of fiber. And behind that is really all the different applications that are being used today across broadband networks, and that continues to evolve. If you think back a number of years ago to what our most commonly used applications were then versus what we're using today, there's quite a bit of evolution happening on that space. Everything from just the increased use of video, but things like IoT and all the devices that are becoming very commonplace in our homes, including video-intensive IoT, such as our Ring doorbells and other types of video-based surveillance. And there's other applications that will be coming down the line. We've heard about augmented reality, virtual reality, some of those targeted at mobile devices, but when you're at home, those mobile devices are connected to your broadband network. So, and there's others that haven't even yet really become pervasive, but they're on their way. So there's a lot of evolution happening there that's going to continue to drive changes that need to be met with. All of that's really driving all of this growth in bandwidth consumption. Alan, you pointed out in the Cisco Visual Networking Index, the tremendous growth in just video across networks and how much that's going to consume. Another interesting stat from OpenVault in their report just last year was that the average household was now consuming over 200 gigabits per month in broadband consumption. And for those that have cut the cord and moved completely away from traditional TV platforms to over the top, it's almost 400 gigabits per month. And both of those numbers are expected to grow 25% year over year. So there's a lot of consumption growth that puts additional strain on the networks that service providers have to have strategies to address. One of those is some different network architectures and carriers wanting to move more of their infrastructure closer to the edge to help address some of these challenges, but that in itself is a challenge. And I'll talk about what we're seeing in the carrier space as they try to shift their network architecture from a more centralized approach to a more distributed, and what some of the benefits that they're hoping to achieve from that. And then lastly is just the average price per user that carriers are able to get from a customer per gigabit delivered has continued to decline. If you think back to the kind of the average subscriber rate at a particular home in any market, when it was DSL, it's about the same as what it is now for fiber. Yet the amount of bandwidth delivered has gone up tremendously. So managing the capacity and the expectations of customers, remaining competitive while managing that cost per gigabit of the infrastructure is another important challenge. So all of those really are key drivers to virtualization, but the other ones are really, agility. And Alan, this ties right back to one of your lead-in slides. Carriers are looking at virtualization as a way to have a more agile network. And, right now with all of the COVID-19, pandemic, being able to quickly shift, bandwidth, increase capacity, things like that are a really good example of how an agile network would help carriers address some of those rapidly shifting changes. Flexibility is another key driver for virtualization, the ability to separate hardware decisions from software functionality, the ability to select the scale of whatever network function that might be more dynamically, whether it's a smaller deployment for a new market or a larger deployment as demand grows, that the flexibility kind of right size the network infrastructure to the current load. And then lastly is really just operational simplicity, having everything more software driven, and the ability to automate that, whether it's through a full NFVI virtualization stack with management and network operations to kind of a unified management across all of the infrastructure that's being deployed. So those are some of the drivers that we're seeing in the marketplace as we work with carriers around the world. So what does virtualization really look like to the carriers that we're working with? And, kind of for the topics today, we're really talking about disaggregating the software and the hardware from physical network function, the PNF, to virtual network functions, where instead of having dedicated hardware-based router, as an example, with its embedded software, when that piece of equipment expires after its useful life, you kind of throw away the software and the hardware together. Also, when you are deploying a physical network appliance, whether it's a router or some other type of function, you really have to consider the scale for your time horizon of its deployment. So you may be looking at a 3-year or 5-year growth plan and size that physical network appliance to that growth, so you're not having to pull it out and physically forklift change it, say every 6 months or a year. On the virtual side, you really have kind of a different approach. You make the hardware decisions very separately from the network functions, whether it's a virtual BNG, your CGNAT, caching services, IP, TV, and voice over IP gateways, and then you can scale those based on the requirements for that particular market. So a lot more flexibility in designing capacity and the ability to kind of build your capacity as your network requires it. So those are reasons why carriers are really trying to move to this virtualization. So for some of this, I'm going to really look at the virtual BNG as an example. But I also wanted to talk about some of the different approaches. So the larger carriers are looking at a more complete virtualization framework. And I think most are probably familiar with the ETSI kind of standard NFVI framework that's been put in place to try to draw some cohesion around how all the different pieces fit together. Everything from the existing OSS, BSS down to the actual infrastructure layer. But one of the points that I do want to talk about, and we'll show you when we get to the customer case studies, is that you don't have to go into this all at once. So particularly the smaller carriers who want to benefit from virtualization don't necessarily need to have all of this framework in place. to be able to benefit from virtualization. There are paths to be able to start with the virtualizing certain functions and then move it into a broader architecture as needs and requirements dictate. So this is probably a good time for a poll.
Yeah, how about that? Good idea, Dave. Great, thanks for setting things up and taking us through all that. So now let's turn to our first audience poll question of the day. It should be on your screens now. I'll read the question for you. Where do you stand with regards to virtualizing network functions? Here are the 6 choices. First choice is currently using virtualization extensively. Second choice is currently have some functions virtualized. Third, we're planning to move to virtualization. Fourth, we're considering our virtualization options. Fifth, we have no plans to virtualize functions. And sixth, I am not a service provider, so not relevant here. Now, we'll take a few moments for the ON24 system to collect all the results. If you want to ask a question of Dave while you're waiting, just type your query into the Ask a Question text area and then click the Submit button. In the meantime, let's bring Dave back for quick questions. So, Dave, let's talk a little bit about compatibility. What are you seeing in terms of virtualized compatibility between virtualized functions and the existing physical functions?
That's a great question, and one that I think service providers that are new to that would be concerned about. Sure. The experience is really driven by the virtual function itself, not so much the hardware, because I think the hardware functionality, 10 gig interface or whatever the network interfaces are fairly standard. It's really the functionality within the software, and that can be validated ahead of time very easily and matched up. So in our experience with our solution, we've found compatibility with all of the existing physical infrastructure they have in place. We haven't seen any issues whatsoever with compatibility.
No problems at all. Wow, I'm amazed. Okay, well, very good, Dave. Now let's see what the survey results, how they came in. It should be up on your screens now. Let's see, the highest percentage was 27%, 5% in the service provider. Okay, so we'll look at the others here. 25% say they're planning to move to virtualization. Almost as many, 23%, say they currently have some functions virtualized, and 12.5% are carrying virtualization out extensively, and 12.5% are considering their virtualization options, and 0 have no plans to virtualize. So everybody's working on virtualization at some stage. I'm a little surprised, Dave. I'm surprised that everybody is working on it. Usually when we do these kinds of polls, we get a good 10 or 20% who say they have no plans. Does this jive with what you're seeing out there in the field?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe a year ago there were some that said, no, I like doing it the traditional way. This is how I've done it for decades. But I think service providers are realizing that one, because others are reporting successful initiatives around it, so it's and just the virtualization as a strategy is becoming more mature. That trust is there, and certainly the benefits are there. So not surprised at all.
Okay. Well, I say this a lot, but I particularly mean it this time around. It'll be really interesting to see what the results of the survey will be a year from now when we do another webinar like this and see where people stand with their network virtualization plans. But for now, I'd like to thank you, Dave. Thanks, everybody out in the audience. And right now, I'm moving the slides further, and I'm going to flip the mic back to Dave. So take it away, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the transitions I talked about was our challenges is that we're seeing some carriers really want to move not only from physical network appliances to virtualization, but also the edge architecture. So I wanted to share why they're doing that and how that's happening in this transition. So just starting with the virtual broadband network gateway as an example of one example within the virtualization of potentially many network functions, you've got the current network where you have central office and multiple central offices going through a metro ring of some sort into a centralized point of presence where they're fairly large-scale platform, fixed capacity is deployed. And then moving to a virtualized environment where they've got some sort of commercially available servers and able to run multiple applications, not just the virtual broadband network gateway, but potentially NAT, CDN, caching, etc., in a much more agile way, just moving to virtualization. But the next piece of that is enabled by moving these to a virtual environment is to be able to then move some of those functions potentially closer to the customer edge, starting with the broadband network gateway, which allows you to get your subscribers onto an IP network. And then it then can be followed with, say, doing NAT locally, all of your CDN, your video caching. And imagine if you take all of your video caching and other CDN closer to the customer edge, how you offload a lot of strain on the metro network, freeing up additional capacity. There's some other performance enhancements as well as low latency applications become more prevalent, just higher performance, better quality of service for the customer themselves. And we've even heard of some carriers partnering with some of the large public cloud vendors to put remote compute resources for some of those cloud-based workloads closer to the customer. So there's a number of benefits that we're seeing, and carriers don't need to start with that end goal. Once they move to kind of the virtualized environment at the centralized point of presence, then it becomes a possibility to move to this more of an edge compute type environment when they're ready.
It's a great chart, Dave. I may have to steal it for future virtualization webinars.
Okay, yeah, no problem. I also wanted to share a specific example of what, if you just think about hardware in the case of a virtual broadband network gateway, what does it actually look like? What can you do in software, and can it actually perform and keep up with some of the dedicated hardware solutions out there? So I took a specific comparison against a fairly well-known vendor's broadband network gateway router versus what you could do today with a virtual BNG software running on a x86-based platform. And this was actually benchmarked in an Intel lab, so these numbers aren't just my own, but they've been independently verified. And you can see that the number of subscribers being able to be supported in a single 1RU platform is quite high, usually more than you need. It's for a single 1RU solution. It's really the performance number, particularly with fiber being the prevalent new capacity that's being deployed for home broadband, being able to handle very large traffic loads in a small footprint. And doing so in a virtualized solution, so getting the benefits of virtualization while achieving the performance that's really required in modern broadband networks. Also, other features such as CGNAT we're seeing included in the new modern virtual BNG solutions out there, as opposed to either a separate dedicated appliance or maybe it's a separate hardware-software module that goes into a traditional router that has a separate price component. And then just from an operational standpoint, looking at the space and power that's required. So companies with green initiatives or just trying to lower OpEx, moving to virtualization can reduce some of the power requirements and space requirements to deliver those same services to customers. And from a scaling standpoint, on the virtual side, it becomes very easy to scale that down use fewer resources on that compute platform if that market doesn't require it, or horizontally scale across multiple compute nodes if you need additional bandwidth as that market grows. So very flexible. As far as transition in the market, so we've been working with carriers globally, both large and small, and we've seen some differences in how the large carriers are approaching virtualization to how some of the smaller and mid-sized carriers are approaching it. We've worked with probably 40% of the top 20 global carriers, and many of them have very mature virtualization strategies. Some are already deploying virtualized solutions throughout their network pretty robustly. We've seen one recently announce a very strong BNG and complete access network with virtualization, but for the most part, we haven't seen a lot of virtual BNG deployments from the large carriers, except in edge cases. But I think that's going to change as they get their this new infrastructure out, this x86-based compute platforms into their central offices and their POPs that then can take those workloads. So we've seen a lot of those, and they're particularly focused on performance, making sure they don't need a whole rack of equipment to replace what they can currently do with a hardware-based platform. And I think in that prior slide I showed that the performance is there now in virtualized solutions. The small and mid-sized carriers are looking at it a little bit differently. We are deploying and have seen deployments of virtual BNG in core use cases, replacing existing infrastructure into their primary networks, and not just in certain smaller markets. Many of them are starting with a broadband network gateway as the first virtualized component or piece of infrastructure, so then they can build from there. And a lot of them are deploying those on dedicated servers as opposed to just a VNF within a broader compute platform. But it is giving them the ability to go forward and start with virtualization, but keeping it simple as a starting point. So, some of the ways to get started with virtualization for those that were in those buckets of planning on it or still considering it. So if you looked at the continuing kind of the BNG as an example, the broadband network gateway, when carriers come up against just a technology refresh, capacity upgrade, or trying to get out of very expensive maintenance contracts, they could replace that with a couple of servers, move that functionality to software. That would be a good place to start. And then over time, as they look to virtualize other components, can then start looking at the MANO and a complete managed NFVI layer, network function virtualization infrastructure, to get additional orchestration, automation, and really put the other pieces together. So they certainly don't have to start with the full architecture just to start getting some of the benefits of virtualization. But once that's in place, it also opens up some new architectures that are being looked at. The distributed edge that I showed a couple slides ago, as well as there's a new architecture that is being worked on, and the larger carriers are really pushing for, which is the CUPS architecture, which is a control plane, user plane separation, where you can almost think of it as a variation of that edge architecture, where the control plane stays in a more centralized environment, but the user plane, the forwarding plane, gets moved closer to the customer. So it allows even more flexibility. And fixed mobile convergence, 5G, all of these other things become possible once some of this critical infrastructure is virtualized. So I think we have time for another poll.
Yep, very good, Dave. Thanks for walking us through all that. So as Dave mentioned, now it's time for our second audience poll, so please take a look at your screens for this one. And here's the question this time. For the service providers who are attending only, why are you starting or planning to start virtualizing some network functions? Once again, we've given you 6 choices. I'll read through them here. First choice is to lower network costs. Second choice is to increase scalability to accommodate traffic growth. Third is to reduce network complexity. Fourth is to reduce time to market for new services. Fifth is all of the above. And sixth is I'm not considering virtualization at this time. Once more, it'll take a few moments for the ON24 system to collect all the results. So once again, if you want to ask Dave a question while you're waiting, just type your query into the Ask a Question text area and then click the Submit button. In the meantime, I'll throw another question to Dave while we're waiting for the results. So Dave, we're asking the audiences, but what are you seeing from your own customers in terms of what their drivers are for virtualization?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of them, it's all of the above, but probably the primary ones is that second one, increasing scalability to accommodate the traffic growth, but at the same time, being able to do that in a cost-effective manner. After we finish the poll, I'm going to share some actual customer case studies of customers that we've worked with and what they were looking at and trying to achieve that I think will mirror what I just said there.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So increased scalability. Let's see what the survey results are. It looks like the top choice is all of the above. 52% said all 4 of the reasons above are the reasons they're doing. When people had chose only one reason, increase of scalability was the leading reason at 18%. Slightly ahead of lowering network costs, ahead of reducing network complexity and reducing time to market for new services. And very few are not considering virtualization, just like we found in the first poll. So this is pretty much what I expect. I figured the highest amount would say all the above, but I'm surprised by how many said all the above, that it was more than half. Is this what you're hearing from your customers too, Dave?
It really is. I think this, if I was to guess, I probably would have guessed similarly. That those that answered an individual question, those top 2, lowering network costs and increasing scalability, with kind of the rest saying really all of the above. I think that is right on track with what I'm seeing in the market. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Dave, and thanks to everyone who took part in both polls today. All right. Now I'm going to hand the controls back to Dave one more time so he can finish up his presentation. So back to you again, Dave.
All right. Thanks, Alan. And I do see we had a question come in that now might be a good time to answer. It was from Alex from Ethernet Wireless, who asks, is NFV now a mature technology? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. Right. So there's very large carriers that have already announced, major virtualization strategies and actual deployments. They're building networks. They've got significant portions of their networks virtualized in different functions in different areas. So it's really the function itself that carrier is going to look at, and is that function and that vendor, is that particular solution, mature on its own. But from a technology standpoint, NFV is absolutely very mature and is being deployed very widely.
All right, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah. Now I want to share a couple specific customer case studies. So these are customers that we've worked with at netElastic with our Virtual BNG solution. The first one is a service provider based in Australia. They're called Harbor ISP, and they've been around for a number of years, but more recently embarked on a focused business strategy to really expand their business significantly. So they've got about 25,000 subscribers, primarily fiber to the home, and they use, in Australia, there's a national broadband network that's partially state sponsored that helps actually put the fiber in across the country, and then service providers like Harbor can then provide the IP services and all of that over that. So they've really seen a significant growth in both the bandwidth across their network and their customers. So those were obviously introducing some challenges. They were straining on the existing solution that they had, which were small scale routers that they were stacking and essentially having to manage dozens of them to keep up with the loads. They wanted to consolidate that. They were also using a dedicated CGNAT appliance from a traditional CGNAT vendor that was very costly to them. And they did look at some of the traditional large-scale physical network appliances, but found it to be very capital intensive because they knew they were going to be going through a lot of growth. So they had to kind of scale it for 3 to 5 years from now. Yet the business wasn't there yet, right? So they didn't have the revenues to really support it, but they knew their business plan. So they were looking for something that would handle the current capacity, but allow them to grow more quickly. So the solution was a virtual BNG from netElastic deployed on 2 servers, and it's done in a redundant pair where either one can be taken out of service for maintenance, and the remaining can take the full load of their customer base. They've got 60 gig facing their access network, feeding to central offices and subscriber circuits coming in from multiple areas, and then 40 gig going to their core network, and all of this in a kind of a non-blocking redundant architecture. They are serving both PPPoE and IPoE subscribers on the fiber network. And they also chose to enable the built-in CGNAT functionality of the BNG. So they were able to eliminate the need for an external CGNAT appliance. And all of that tied into their existing radius-driven AAA for the authentication, authorization, interface to their billing, and all of that. And then to help them have visibility to their network and their subscribers, they used the BNG Manager tool that comes with the solution that gives them deep visibility into not only traffic statistics on aggregate as well as individual interfaces, but also very detailed information about individual subscribers to aid with troubleshooting and customer experience once they're in operation. And so what were the results? So in this case, they were able to expand the capacity more than 10x from where they were. They increased the support for the number of subscribers that they can handle on the network. They reported their numbers, not mine, 70% savings versus the traditional platform that they were considering to solve the same use case. And they've got now, that agility to change and scale this as they need to. So a good example is because of their growth, they're already ready to add some additional nodes to that 2-node cluster that they're operating today. That'll give them additional capacity for more subscribers that they're adding to the network very easily. So they don't change the rest of the integration, how it works. They just add one more node to expand the compute resources for that solution. So that's been a real good positive use case. They've been operating. This kind of goes back to the maturity question. They've been using this solution for about a year now, and it's been really flawless, perfect for them. So the next case study is a carrier based in Argentina, and they're Telefónica de Pinamar. They are the phone company and fiber to the home carrier for the Pinamar region in Argentina, and they go by Telpin. And they've got about 30,000 customers across 3 cities, and typically use Huawei and Juniper traditional hardware platforms. As Argentina is a lower GDP country, the high costs are particularly challenged to Telpin, and they really needed something that would be easier for them to grow, kind of pay and build as you expand, as opposed to high cost up front. So the solution that we proposed was very similar to the Harbor. Basically a virtual broadband network gateway software running on COTS hardware that they were able to source locally. So that was one of the other challenges, was getting the equipment that they needed. So they were able to source the servers from their local vendors. And then we assisted with the integration and basically making it fit within their network the same way that their existing platform. So this kind of goes back to that compatibility, and it essentially went in without having to change their architecture. And they were able to start with a very small deployment, just 2,000 subscribers, and then they upgraded as they continued to migrate. So for them, they've now been able to move all of their subscribers, completely eliminate their first Juniper MX router out of their network, so they can discontinue maintenance on that. It allowed them to handle not only the current load, but additional subscriber growth, and really get to that pay-as-you-go agility that they want. So the first city's been completed, and we look forward to working with them to achieve that same result in their other markets. So in closing, it's really virtualization really helps carriers handle this explosive demand for broadband and broadband growth that traditional architectures struggle to do, and really provides that agility and flexibility to allow carriers to more quickly adapt to changing customer needs. And of course, we think that the virtual broadband network gateway is a good place to start that virtualization journey, and there are ways to do that incrementally, so it doesn't need to be an all-in type approach. So I hope that was informative.
I think that was excellent, Dave. Thanks very much for wrapping things up here. All right, so that concludes the more formal part of the webinar. Now it's time to tackle your questions out there. So let's see what we have in the queue so far. While I'm doing that, as a reminder, to participate in the Q&A, just type your question into the text box located below the media player, and then click the Submit Question button. So let's take a look at what we have here. I know we have a few questions. Let's see. Okay. I think we discussed how mature our technology NFV is, so I'll mark that one as answered. Okay. Let's take a look at the next question here. In moving to virtualized networks, let's hold on a sec. Let me get it all in front of me. In moving to virtualized network functions, my biggest concern is compatibility with existing systems. Dave, you talked about that a little bit. Did you have anything more you wanted to say about that, or did we cover it already?
Yeah, I think we covered that, and as I just shared in that case study, it's a real good example of taking an existing, fairly well-known, mature hardware-based solution and replacing it with a virtualized solution without really disrupting the rest of the network. So the same interfaces for BGP and OSPF going to the core network, the core routers on the next hop up, as well as the access technologies, PPPoE, IPoE, et cetera, for the access side of the network, as well as the managing rate plans and things like that within a BNG context work great. And the same thing is true for other types of virtualized solutions, whether it's CGNAT or caching servers, et cetera. So I haven't really seen any issues with compatibility.
Okay, fair enough. Next question is on those two case studies that you went through. What kind of servers are the two customers using?
So that's one of the great things about virtualization is that carriers can really pick the hardware that they want, separate from the software functionality. So in the case of the customer in Australia, they're using servers from Dell. They're R740s that fairly ubiquitous in the market. They're easy to procure, and they've got their local source. And we're familiar with that vendor previously, so they just continue to use that. The one in Argentina, they picked one from a local vendor there, but they're still x86-based servers with enough essentially compute resources, RAM, and network interfaces that meet the use case requirements. So depending on the performance desired, they can run a virtual network function in a very, very small virtual machine, all the way up to using essentially VMs that consume the entire compute platform, depending on their use case and their performance requirements and capacity requirements. So most virtual network functions can be scaled that way based on how much hardware you give it.
Okay, fair enough. Next question is, how are the physical connections managed in a virtual world with commodity servers?
So the physical connections, I assume they're meaning that the interfaces, say in and out of the servers. We're talking about 1 gig, 10, 25, 40 gig interfaces that are, generally Ethernet and then, IP or some other layer 2 to either a switch or the next hop up or down to, say, an OLT or DSLAM. So it's, it's not any different than if it was a physical hardware. It can be, fiber connections or copper connections. The difference is instead of a very expensive proprietary line card as the physical interface, you're talking about network interface cards that are very inexpensive and widely available, providing that same Ethernet physical connectivity.
Okay. Well, we have time for a couple more questions before the end of this webinar, but before I ask anything else, I just want to let you know that I pushed an evaluation form onto your screens a couple minutes ago. So please complete this form so that we can get some feedback about what you liked and didn't like about this webinar. Please also tell us what you'd like us to cover in the future. To complete the form, please just press the Submit Answer button at the bottom of the page. Thanks. Okay, so while you're completing the form, I'll go ahead with we have a couple more questions in here. So we'll start with this one. Dave, are you seeing CUPS important? Do you see CUPS as being important in future tech and future architectures?
I do, particularly for the carriers that are trying to move to that distributed edge, where they don't want to put everything at the edge. They want to put the forwarding traffic, so essentially the user plane, close to the customer edge, but have more of a centralized control over it. So that is one of the reasons we've already got some field trials in place with our CUPS architecture, and that'll be coming out in GA release later this year for those carriers that want to deploy it that way. And that's coming to, we're obviously doing that because we're getting direct carrier feedback that they want to deploy that way.
Right, okay. Thanks. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. In the customer case studies, how did they handle redundancy across the BNG servers?
So that's a good question. So in the case of the ISP in Australia and what's common with most of our deployments is essentially an N+1 cluster of the compute resources or the BNG instance, making sure that they're spread across hardware, so you've got hardware and software redundancy. And then we basically are enabling load balancing of the subscriber traffic coming in using a delay mechanism where the primary BNG will accept that traffic immediately, terminate the subscriber, and manage it from then on. But if that primary BNG was not available due to scheduled or unscheduled maintenance, the secondary one, after a short 10 to 100 millisecond delay, will see that the first one didn't answer, and it will take that connection and manage that. And using that mechanism, we can do a 2-node cluster all the way up to 10+ node cluster for very, very large scale deployments, and spread the subscriber sessions across all of them, where you don't have to do 2x redundancy. You just do the n+1 and still carry all the load in case one in the cluster fails.
Interesting.
And it's working really well for them. So they've done scheduled maintenance and had really no impact on their operational capability.
Interesting. Okay. I'm going to exercise my moderator's privilege and ask you one last question. When we do this webinar, say in March 2021, what do you think will have changed on the virtualization front?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when we get to those polls, we will see even more saying, "Hey, I'm already doing it," and both somewhat and extensively. I think a year from now, even more carriers will have heavily adopted virtualization throughout their networks. I also think that we'll continue to see performance of software-based virtual network functions improve. That's one of the areas that we've tried to be a leader in the performance aspects, because it's really important for the fiber-based networks. We expect other components within the virtualization side to move that direction as well.
Okay, and if people only took away one or two things from this webinar, what would you want them to take away?
Well, I really think that a couple of questions that we got from the audience. One was, is it mature enough, and is it compatible with the rest of my network? So one, the answer is absolutely yes. People are using it live throughout their networks today, and it is not something that is really forward-looking. It's being deployed today, and carriers are getting the benefit of it today, both large and small. So you don't have to go in with a very complex architecture. You can start with, just virtualization on some dedicated compute nodes, and then evolve from there. So there are ways to start simply, get some of those benefits, and then move that into a much more comprehensive architecture over time.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Dave. Thank you for fielding all those questions. Well, I'm afraid that we've run out of time, so I'd like to thank you all out there for attending, and special thanks to our main speaker, Dave Williams of netElastic Systems, for carrying the heavy load today. Let's give him a virtual salute. This webinar will be archived on the Broadband World News website for the next year, starting later this week. Within the next 24 to 48 hours, you should receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. So feel free to review the webinar whenever you'd like over the next 12 months. This webinar is copyright 2020 by Broadband World News and Light Reading. The presentation materials are owned or copyrighted by Broadband World News and Light Reading and netElastic Systems. These companies and their speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of all of us here, thanks again for joining us today. Take care, everybody, and congratulations to Beth on her first webinar for us. Take care, everyone.